One of the most tragic kings of England was Henry VI, who is remembered today to have been somewhat of a loser during the Wars of the Roses. He was made King of England and France throughout his life, but he was very young when he reigned. Throughout his time as the King of England, he lost a large amount of territory in France, but the latter part of his reign was spent fighting during the Wars of the Roses and defending his claims to the throne against the House of York. But Henry VI was slaughtered inside the walls of the Tower of London, being murdered by his enemies as he was held at the hands of King Edward IV. But Henry's death whilst he was praying was barbaric and brutal, but he was then buried inside the walls of St. George's Chapel in Windsor, eventually. However, when his coffin was opened, it was found that he had in fact died a very bloody death. As centuries on, marks regarding his murder were found on his body, and this shocked historians. But what is the story of opening the coffin of the murdered medieval King of England? Henry VI came onto the throne succeeding his father, Henry V, on the 1st of September 1422. He was also proclaimed the King of France in accordance with the treaties of Troyes. He was considered old enough to rule for himself in 1437, and he was a headstrong young boy. However, he was also very pious. But in England, politics were dominated by a series of court rivalries between different dukes. He was a passive man and did not seem to like warfare and violence. But at times Henry VI was rather mentally unstable. He was an ineffective king that saw him lose much of France, and he married the niece of Charles VII, Margaret of Anjou. There was a lot of political instability in England, especially as Henry VI was deemed unfit to rule, and power was exercised by a number of nobles who argued, and this caused a significant amount of chaos. But Queen Margaret tried to establish herself as the power behind the throne. However, despite Henry VI recovering from his breakdown brought about by the loss of France and the stresses of the kingship, he had much more to worry about as the Wars of the Roses broke out across England. Tensions between the House of York and Lancaster erupted into all-out open war, and there were many different battles fought between the two over the next decades. The king was captured following the Battle of Northampton, and he was then captured by the Yorkists. The real power that Henry VI's forces were fighting was the future king, Edward IV. Following the Battle of Towton, Henry's forces had a severe defeat, and this was considered one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil. But following further defeats, Henry VI was deposed of the throne, and he was then held captive inside of the Tower of London, a prisoner of the new king, Edward IV. Henry was briefly restored to the throne following the efforts of Warwick Kingmaker, the Earl of Warwick, who managed to defeat Edward's forces. However, this was only for a brief time, and because this had never been done before, a word, the redemption, was invented for a king who was restored to the throne. However, Henry VI's second reign lasted a matter of months. During the Battle of Barnet, the Earl of Warwick was killed, and following the Battle of Tewkesbury, Henry's son Edward was killed, and the king yet again found himself imprisoned inside the Tower of London. He was inside of the infamous fortress, and it would not be long before he was put to the sword. For the new king, Edward IV, it was dangerous to have Henry alive as long as he was living. He served as a threat to his reign and was a symbol of Lancastrian threat. In other words, Edward feared Henry VI being broken out of the tower and then being used as a spearhead for the Lancastrian cause, continuing the Wars of the Roses. However, the death of Henry VI is reported to have occurred on the night of the 21st of May 1471. It's claimed that whilst he was praying inside of his residence and rooms in the Wakefield Tower in his private chapel that Henry VI was slaughtered whilst kneeling at the altar in what was a very brutal and bloody death. Sir Thomas More, a Tudor historian, wrote in his accounts of the life of Richard III that it was the later Yorkist king Richard III who killed Henry whilst he was the Duke of Gloucester. Whoever killed Henry VI must have been allowed inside of the tower to do this. There were other accounts produced that claimed that the king died from melancholy or depression following discovering that his son had died. However, following his death, Henry VI's body was taken to St Paul's Cathedral in an open coffin, and it was then taken to Blackfriars on the other side of the River Thames, and it was noted that the king's corpse was bleeding. From Blackfriars, a boat carried the king's body to Chertsey Abbey, where he was then buried in the Lady Chapel, and there was some debate whether he was placed inside of a earthen grave rather than a burial vault. However, Henry VI's remains were embalmed, and wax linen and spices were used and purchased for his embalming, and this cost £15 and 3 shillings. But whilst at Chertsey Abbey, the burial site of Henry VI became a pilgrimage place, and because of this, King Richard III had the remains exhumed on the 12th of August 1484. They were allegedly perfectly preserved, and the body was taken to Windsor Castle, and then St George's Chapel, and with this he was interred opposite his great enemy, Edward IV, inside of the burial vault. But some even tried to appeal to the Pope for the creation of Henry VI as a saint for his life and death, and Henry VII then planned to rebuild part of Windsor Castle to hold many different remains. However, over the years, many places, including Westminster Abbey and Chertsey Abbey, appealed to have the remains of Henry VI reburied there. Designs for a new tomb were drawn up, and a shrine was planned to commemorate Henry VI. Henry's body remained at Windsor, and his monument was dismantled towards the latter part of the 16th century, and his burial site was then left unmarked. However, Henry VI's vault was relocated in 1786, but it was at this point not opened, and a small slab was placed to mark the site. But in January of 1910, the brick vault containing Henry VI's body was opened, and inside a small lead chest was found, along with a lot of rubbish, including iron straps from a decayed coffin that measured around 2 metres long and 1 metre wide. The chest was investigated on the 5th of November 1910, and inside it was found to house a decayed wooden box, and inside of this, the gathered bones of Henry VI. These bones were not in the correct order, and the skull was said to have been broken and the right arm was missing. But something remarkable was found on the skull, which gave historians a closer insight into the brutal death of King Henry VI. On the skull was found some brown hair which was attached to the skull. Part of the hair was rather darker, and it was matted with blood, meaning that the king's hair had not been washed following his death during the embalming process, and that his blood from his death around 500 years before was still on his hair. This showed historians the truth of his death was brutal and bloody, and that Henry VI was presumably murdered, as was believed, inside the Tower of London. He was either stabbed or battered over the head with a heavy object. Following this discovery, the chest was repaired, and the bones which were inside were wrapped in silk, and were then interred inside of a new wooden box, along with parts of the old box and the ironwork from it. But then a new marble slab was placed above the vault inside of St George's Chapel. King Henry VI is seen in history as a weak and feeble king who achieved very little throughout his reign. But one of the biggest achievements was the educational establishments he founded, which included Eton College and King's College in Cambridge. Despite being a monarch who was slaughtered inside the Tower of London, his legacy still lives on in these establishments today. But he was a king who was heavily influenced by a number of powerful nobles, who sought influence for themselves, leading to the king being poorly advised. But there are other historians who see Henry VI in a different light, a rather tragic figure who was very generous and devoted his life to religion. However, his issues, they say, were caused by the problems of King Richard II being deposed. However, what is clear is that he died a violent death due to the discovery of blood on his skull and in his hair 500 years after his death. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.